Hi everybody, this is a review for your first unit exam on ecology. So the first question we asked in class was, why do some populations grow, decline, or remain stable? To understand this, you have to really understand this idea of a limiting factor. So a limiting factor is something in an ecosystem that stops a population from just continuing to increase or continuing to do exponential growth. So if you take a look at the bottom here, this graph is showing exponential growth. And in this graph, the population is just going to keep increasing, but that's not possible. There is a limited amount of resources that the organism can have. So these limiting factors can be things like space, which is abiotic. That's something that's not alive. Or it could be biotic, things like the amount of food they can get, the amount of mates they can get. These factors affect not only animals, but they affect plants as well. So the amount of sunlight an ecosystem has, the amount of space or nutrients in the soil, these are all things that stop a population from increasing forever. And as a population runs out of whatever its limiting factor is, it reaches kind of the limit. It reaches what we say is a carrying capacity or an equilibrium. It's a place where it's very balanced. Now on this graph, it shows the carrying capacity kind of getting to a very nice steady place. And although large populations do get steady and they even out, they don't typically go like flat like this. They'll typically do a little bit of an overshoot and then they will fluctuate for some time. But they do reach a place where they are mostly stable. And if we change a factor, we can change the carrying capacity. For example, if we have a forest ecosystem and we reduce the amount of sunlight by half, then the amount of plants there is not going to be as high. So the carrying capacity is going to drop. The second question we asked in class was, how is energy transfer between different species in a community? So to answer this question, there's really two parts to this question. The first is looking at feeding relationships. So to do that, we looked at a food web. This is something that you probably saw in elementary school or middle school. We show the organism and we show an arrow to show which way the energy goes, not necessarily what's eating what. So in this situation, the rat is not eating the python, it's giving its energy to the python. And it all starts with our producers down here. So our producers are on the bottom level. Things that eat producers are called consumers. We have primary consumers. Secondary consumers would be this frog. Tertiary consumer would be like this python, and if it ate that frog, and if the eagle ate the python, it would be a quaternary consumer. Now, to better understand those relationships, we can take a look at a trophic pyramid. And the reason why a pyramid is such a great example is because the pyramid gets smaller as we go to the top, and so does the amount of energy that's available in an ecosystem. So only 10% of energy is usable by that next organism. 90% of the energy is lost. It's not really lost per se. It's just not usable. It's either not digestible or it's used, it is lost as heat, but it doesn't like disappear. So you can see here we have the producers, the energy transferred moves up each time and it gets smaller and smaller. So if we imagine in this particular ecosystem, there's 100,000 joules, that's a unit of energy, of plants, then there would only be 10,000 joules of energy on this level where the rabbits are, 1,000 where the snakes are, and then just 100 where this tertiary consumer is. So there is a limit. And the reason why we don't have a 12th level consumer is because there just isn't enough energy or calories the further you go up the pyramid. Therefore, it's a lot more efficient to eat on the level where the rabbits are than to eat on the level where the hawk is. Then we talked about the advantages and disadvantages of social behavior, especially in terms of hunting. So a solitary animal is one that's found alone, except for when it's mating or raising its young. So a solitary animal, the positive things about being solitary is that you have very stealthy hunting. You're able to camouflage pretty easily alone. There's no sharing of your prey. What you get is what you get, and there's less disease spread. So if you are a mountain lion who is a solitary organism, they're not encountering other mountain lions that often. There's less chance of communicating diseases. However, there's also no help rearing young. A mother mountain lion is on her own when it comes to raising her cubs. There's no such thing as safety in numbers, and there's no group hunting, so there's no help. A truly social animal is one that forms bonds with other organisms of its kind, and they have some sort of order. So great examples of this are obviously humans, chimpanzees, meerkats, most of the great apes, gorillas as well, bonobos. They all have some kind of social order, and they have bonds with each other, just like we have bonds with our cousins, our aunties, our uncles. These animals also have these bonds. And the positive is that they have group childcare, just like humans do, where, grandma maybe take care of you when you were young, or, uncle picks you up from school. Well, similar things in these animals where they're helping care for the babies. They're also helping hunt together. There's animals that aren't necessarily truly social, but they group together, and they do get some of the advantages as well. So grouping animals, think about things like deer that will be in a herd, or fish that will swim in a group together. They get some of the advantages of safety in numbers. A con to being a social animal or a grouping animal is that you're going to be sharing more diseases, you're going to have to share food, and you're sharing responsibility of caring for young. The last question we talked about is how humans are threatening these systems, these ecosystems, and then the biodiversity that already exists on the planet. So we went over 6 main threats to biodiversity. And the first one, overpopulation in humans, is the one that is making everything worse. So if you think about any action you take, let's say you leave your car running for a few minutes, or you leave a light on at your house. It's not a big deal if you do it. But if you think there's 7.7 billion humans in the world, and if we all do those actions, then the consequences add up really quickly. So all the 5 other ones that are listed here are made worse by the fact that there's so many of us. So pollution that's a pretty obvious one. We're putting chemicals and gases in our atmosphere that just don't belong. Invasive species are species that are not necessarily bad because of what they are, but they're bad because of where they are. They don't belong where they are. And so that food web that we looked at a few slides ago, they don't belong on that food web. And so nothing keeps them in check. There's no limiting factors for them. And so they will grow out of control. And a great example of this is the Burmese python in Florida. It does not belong in Florida, but it is a dominant snake in that ecosystem, and it is eating everything: deer, alligators, dogs. If it can get its mouth on it, that is something that it's eating. Climate change is another threat to biodiversity. As the climate warms, some ecosystems are no longer suitable for all organisms that live there. And I know most of us have seen the images of polar bears starving because there's not enough ice to support them anymore. Just a few slides ago, we talked about these limiting factors. If we decrease the limiting factor, let's say we decrease the amount of ice that's necessary for a polar bear to live, we're going to decrease the amount of polar bears that can survive in that ecosystem. And eventually, we may reduce it so much that there are none anymore. Habitat destruction is another way that humans are affecting biodiversity. We can degrade a habitat, meaning that we make it so poor that it can't support life anymore. We do this a lot in agricultural practices like over farming, clear cutting forest, destroying the soil quality of particular areas. We also have something called habitat fragmentation, which is not something a lot of people think about, but it's very relevant here in LA, where we're putting highways and maybe farms in between habitats that existed, making them basically smaller and a lot of times less usable by our top predators. Mountain lions, which is what we've talked about this whole unit, need a vast place to roam. And if we give it small little patches of territory, it's not as good as one continuous chunk of land. And then finally, overexploitation, just taking too much of our natural resources, whether that is taking too much water from a place, taking too much of an organism from a place. So we looked at the example of in the 1800s, bison, who were once in the millions in the United States, were completely decimated just because we took too much. And so the last question that we talked about in class, or that we wrote in our notebooks was, how do we address some of these concerns? And really, the way that we address some of these concerns is just by addressing the threats themselves. So if we can address these invasive species and prevent having invasive species, or we can address climate change and mitigate the impacts we're having on the climate, or we can avoid overexploiting our resources, and we're responsible with our land use so we don't have habitat destruction, then we can start looking at how can we conserve biodiversity. And biodiversity is so important because it makes our ecosystems stronger. If we have a very biodiverse ecosystem and we lose something, then our ecosystem will likely survive. But as we lose biodiversity in an ecosystem, we also lose its strength. So this was your review. Make sure that you study your notes. There's a Quizlet posted and a Kahoot posted. And of course, if you have any questions, come see me.